The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and decayed leaves. Lauren and her three friends, Ryan, Claire, and Alex, were excited for their weekend hike through Whispering Woods, a sprawling forest in the Pacific Northwest with a notorious reputation. Despite the countless stories of missing hikers and eerie phenomena, the group laughed off the warnings. Urban legends, they thought, nothing more. They set out mid-morning, following a well-worn trail that wove through towering evergreens. The first few hours were uneventful, even idyllic, with sunlight streaming through the canopy. But as they ventured deeper, the forest seemed to change. The air grew heavier, muffling their voices, and the trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches like skeletal hands. Around midday, they came across an old wooden sign nailed to a tree. The faded letters read, "Turn back now." Alex snickered. "Classic horror movie setup," he said, but his voice carried a nervous edge. Claire took a picture of the sign, laughing it off, but no one else joined in. Unease settled over the group. The trail twisted and turned until it became unrecognizable, marked only by faint, erratic footprints in the soft dirt. Ryan pulled out his map, frowning. "We should have hit the clearing by now," he muttered. His words only deepened the creeping tension. The forest was vast, and losing their way wasn't part of the plan. As they argued over whether to push forward or backtrack, a faint sound floated through the air. A low, rhythmic tapping, like a branch hitting a tree. "Probably just woodpeckers," Claire said, though her voice quavered. But the sound didn't match the cadence of a bird. It was too deliberate, too human. They decided to press on, ignoring the gnawing sense of being watched. As evening approached, the tapping grew louder and closer by Flurnisrakat, accompanied by faint whispers. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the voices carried a sinister tone, low and guttural, as though spoken through clenched teeth. Lauren stopped in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The others nodded, their eyes darting nervously through the dense undergrowth. The forest, once alive with birdsong, had fallen silent, save for the whispers and tapping. Ryan suggested setting up camp before it got too dark. They found a small clearing and hurriedly pitched their tents. By the time they'd gathered around a hastily built fire, the whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. They sat close, their eyes scanning the shadows just beyond the flickering firelight. Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every so often, she thought she saw movement at the edge of the clearing, a dark figure slipping behind a tree, gone the moment she focused. She kept it to herself, not wanting to alarm the others. When Alex cracked a joke to lighten the mood, no one laughed. The night wore on, and sleep became impossible. Around 2 a.m., Claire let out a sharp gasp, waking the others. "Something's outside my tent," she whispered frantically. They all froze, listening. From the darkness came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the campsite. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows that danced ominously among the trees. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and unzipped his tent, stepping cautiously into the night. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. The footsteps stopped and the oppressive silence returned. But as Ryan turned back, the flashlight flickered, catching something in the distance. Two glowing eyes reflected in the beam, too high off the ground to belong to any known animal. "Run!" Ryan shouted, bolting for the tent. Chaos erupted as the group scrambled to pack what they could. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, their sinister tones now forming words they couldn't understand. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, urging them deeper into its grasp. They abandoned their campsite, running blindly through the darkness. The trail was impossible to find, and every direction looked the same. Trees loomed like twisted sentinels, their branches snagging clothes and hair. The tapping was all around them now, an ominous beat that quickened with their pace. Then Claire screamed. Lauren turned to see her friend being dragged into the undergrowth by something. Someone shrouded in shadow. The others rushed to help, but it was as if the forest itself conspired against them, roots and branches tangling their feet. By the time they reached the spot, Claire was gone, her screams swallowed by the unrelenting whispers. Panic consumed them. They ran until their lungs burned, stopping only when they stumbled into another clearing. There in the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered and door ajar. Desperation overrode fear, and they burst inside, slamming the door behind them. The cabin was decrepit, filled with rotting furniture and strange symbols carved into the walls. The air was thick with a foul stench, and the whispers seemed louder inside, as though the walls themselves spoke. They barricaded the door and huddled together, trying to catch their breath. But the safety was short-lived. A loud knock came from the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin. "Who's there?" Alex shouted, his voice trembling. There was no reply, only another knock, this time louder. The whispers crescendoed, forming a cacophony of unintelligible voices. The door burst open, though no one stood there. The tapping grew deafening, pounding in their ears as shadows flooded the room, their shapes shifting and writhing like living smoke. One by one, the group was swallowed by the darkness, their screams fading into the whispers. By morning, the forest was silent again, the clearing empty save for the abandoned cabin. Search parties would land the campsite, their scattered belongings, but no sign of the hikers. Whispering Woods claimed them as it had so many before, their fate a chilling reminder of the warnings ignored. To this day, locals swear they can hear the whispers on quiet nights, carried on the wind through the trees. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains lies a trail that's unmarked on maps. Locals call it the Forgotten Trail, a place whispered about in hushed tones and avoided by even the bravest hikers. Its reputation is steeped in disappearances, strange sightings, and chilling tales that no one dares confirm. But Jake, a seasoned outdoorsman, dismissed the rumors as backwoods superstition. He craved solitude, a break from the noise of city life, and the thrill of exploring the unexplored. One misty morning, Jake parked his car near the base of the mountains, strapped on his pack, and ventured into the woods. The entrance to the trail was barely discernible, marked only by a weathered tree with deep claw-like gashes in its bark. The air was thick with the damp smell of moss and decay, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, only the crunch of his boots on the underbrush. As he moved deeper into the woods, the trail seemed to shift beneath him. What started as a clear path turned into a maze of tangled roots and overgrown foliage. He checked his GPS, but the screen flickered, the map glitching before freezing entirely. Frustrated, Jake continued onward, relying on his instincts. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew unnaturally tall, their bark dark and twisted, their branches weaving together to block out the sunlight. By midday, Jake began to notice strange markings on the trees, symbols carved into the bark that looked ancient, their meaning indecipherable. He snapped a few pictures with his phone, but each image came out distorted, the symbols appearing as smudges of black ink. A chill ran down his spine, but he shook it off, blaming fatigue. As the sun began to set, the forest came alive with strange sounds. Faint whispers seemed to echo through the trees, growing louder and more insistent the further he walked. Jake called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. He told himself it was the wind, but the whispers sounded human, pleading, warning, accusing. He decided to set up camp, choosing a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. As night fell, the forest seemed to close in around him. The fire's glow illuminated the immediate area, but beyond that, darkness reigned, thick and impenetrable. Jake tried to eat, but his appetite was gone. The whispers were back, louder now, circling the campsite like a predator stalking its prey. Suddenly, a sharp crack of a branch snapped his attention to the edge of the clearing. He grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam revealed nothing at first. Then, just beyond the firelight, he saw movement. A figure, tall and gaunt, stood motionless among the trees. Its limbs were impossibly long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but the whispers grew louder, more frantic. They weren't coming from the figure, they were coming from all around him. Jake bolted for his tent, zipping it shut as if the thin fabric could protect him. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. Outside, the whispers escalated into guttural chants, voices overlapping in an eerie, chaotic symphony. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against the tense fabric, followed by the sound of heavy breathing. He held his hunting knife close, his heart hammering in his chest. The scratching stopped, replaced by silence. Jake waited, every nerve on edge, until he finally summoned the courage to unzip the tent and peek outside. The fire was out, the clearing bathed in moonlight. The figure was gone. He stepped out, knife in hand, scanning the area. The forest was still and silent, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Then he saw them. Dozens of figures emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Their bodies were skeletal, their faces obscured by darkness, but he could feel their gaze. Panicking, Jake ran, crashing through the underbrush, heedless of the branches clawing at his face and arms. The figures followed, their movements eerily smooth, gliding over the uneven terrain without a sound. The whispers were deafening now, words he couldn't understand pounding in his ears. Jake tripped over a root and fell hard, his knife skittering out of reach. As he scrambled to his feet, he realized he was no longer on the trail. He was in a clearing surrounded by a perfect circle of trees. In the center stood a massive stone altar, its surface slick with something dark and wet. The air reeked of iron and decay. The figures surrounded him, forming a silent, motionless ring. Jake screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the forest. One by one, the figures raised their arms, pointing at him. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. Jake's vision blurred, his head pounding as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. The last thing he saw was the altar, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light, before darkness consumed him. Days later, a search party found Jake's car, but no sign of him. The forgotten trail remained unmarked and unexplored, its secrets buried deep within the cursed forest. Those who knew the legends spoke of him in hushed tones, adding his name to the long list of the vanished, another victim of the trail that no one dared to follow. Nestled in the dense wilderness of the Rockies, Pine Creek Trail was a favorite for those seeking solitude, but locals rarely hiked it, especially during the colder months. They called it cursed ground, a place where the Hollow Ones lingered, beings that wore the faces of the lost. Megan, Chris, and Laura had heard the stories, but they were skeptics. Urban legends didn't scare them. What better way to challenge a local myth than with a weekend hike into the heart of Pine Creek? The trail started innocently enough. The air was brisk, the ground frosted, and the towering evergreens seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The three friends laughed as they trudged deeper into the woods, their breath fogging in the chilly air. They passed a few faded warning signs nailed to trees, but the words were too weathered to read. As the hours passed, the trail grew steeper and less distinct. At times, the path seemed to fork in impossible ways, leaving them to guess which direction to take. Chris checked the map repeatedly, but it never seemed to align with their surroundings. The trees grew closer together, their trunks warped and knotted as if writhing in pain. By late afternoon, they reached a peculiar clearing. In the center stood a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked ancient, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and time. Megan suggested checking it out, eager to take a break and snap some photos, but Laura hesitated. Something about the place felt off. The air was too still, the silence unnerving. Inside, the cabin was worse. The walls were covered in crude carvings, strange spirals and symbols that seemed to pulse when looked at too long. The floor was littered with animal bones, arranged in spiraling patterns that mimicked the carvings. Chris laughed nervously, calling it a wannabe witch's den. But Megan found something that made her pause. A rusty lantern with dried blood on its handle. "Maybe we should keep moving," Laura said, her voice trembling. The others agreed, though none of them admitted how their stomachs churned with unease. The group pressed on, but the forest seemed to shift around them. Landmarks they'd passed hours ago reappeared, as though they were walking in circles. Chris tried to make light of it, but his jokes fell flat. They began to feel the weight of the forest's gaze, an oppressive presence that pressed against their skin. As dusk fell, they heard it. Faint whispers carried on the wind. At first, it sounded like distant voices, unintelligible and fragmented, but as they walked, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Help me," a voice pleaded. Megan froze. It was a child's voice, soft and desperate, coming from somewhere ahead. "That's not funny," Chris said, glancing at Laura, but her face was pale, her wide eyes locked on the darkening trail. "Someone's out here," Megan insisted, her instincts kicking in. Against her friend's protest, she followed the voice, calling out, "Hello? Are you hurt?" The others reluctantly followed, their footsteps crunching over frost-covered leaves. The voice grew fainter, always just out of reach, leading them deeper into the forest. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was suffocating. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, the trees taller. Megan turned to Chris and Laura. "Did you hear that?" Before they could answer, another sound emerged, a low, wet gurgling noise. It came from behind them. Slowly, they turned. Standing in the middle of the trail was a figure. It wore a tattered flannel shirt and jeans, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The face was blank at first, featureless, but as they stared, it began to change. A face emerged from the void, one that looked eerily like Chris's. "What the?" Chris stammered, backing away. The figure twitched, its limbs jerking like a puppet on strings. It took a step toward them, and as it did, another figure emerged from the shadows, then another. Each one bore an uncanny resemblance to one of them, their faces contorted in grotesque mockeries of human expression. "Run!" Laura screamed. They bolted, the sound of snapping twigs and crunching leaves chasing them through the forest. The whispers returned, now accompanied by guttural growls and laughter that echoed unnaturally, coming from every direction. Megan glanced over her shoulder and saw one of the figures gaining on them. Its legs moved unnaturally fast, bending in ways that defied anatomy. She stumbled, catching herself just in time to keep running. They burst into another clearing, but this one was worse. Dozens of the figures stood in a silent circle, their blank faces morphing into those of the trio as they entered. In the center of the circle stood an ancient stone well, its edges jagged and covered in moss. The whispers grew deafening as the figures closed in, their malformed hands reaching. Chris screamed as one grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the well. Megan and Laura tried to pull him free, but the figures were unnaturally strong. "Don't let go," Chris shouted, his voice breaking, but the pull was relentless. Megan watched in horror as Chris was dragged into the well, his screams echoing into the void. The figures turned their attention to her and Laura, their faces stretching into horrific grins. They ran again, but the forest felt endless, the trees growing denser, the air colder. Laura's cries faded as one of the figures grabbed her, and Megan dared not look back. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing near a creek as the first rays of dawn pierced the canopy. When rescuers found her days later, Megan was alone, her clothes torn, and her skin scratched raw. She spoke of creatures that wore faces and a cursed well, but her words were dismissed as the ramblings of someone traumatized by the elements. To this day, Pine Creek remains untouched by all but the foolish or the desperate. Locals say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the whispers and see the faces of the lost in the shadows of the trees, pleading for help you can never give. Deep in the Ozark Mountains lies a forgotten trail known as Devil's Hollow. The story goes that anyone who hikes it at night sees a lantern swinging in the fog, always ahead, always leading them astray. Most chalk it up to folklore, but when Sam, a wildlife photographer, heard the tale, he couldn't resist the challenge. A man of logic, he planned to prove that the eerie stories were nothing more than local superstition. Armed with his camera, flashlight, and a sturdy backpack, Sam entered the trail just before sunset. The hollow was eerily beautiful, cloaked in vibrant autumn colors. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sounds were the crunch of his boots and the distant calls of owls. He followed the twisting path into the dense woods, confident and unworried. As night fell, a thick fog rolled in, curling through the trees like ghostly fingers. The trail markers vanished in the haze, but Sam wasn't concerned. His flashlight cut through the mist, and he marked his path with ribbons tied to low branches. He felt in control, his pulse steady. It wasn't long before he spotted it, a faint golden light bobbing in the distance. His breath caught. The light moved as though carried by an unseen hand, weaving between the trees. Sam smirked, thinking it was likely another hiker, maybe someone pulling a prank. "Hello?" he called out. His voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the fog. The lantern didn't stop. It flickered, almost taunting, and continued its steady sway deeper into the woods. Sam hesitated. Every instinct told him to turn back, but curiosity overpowered his fear. He followed. The further he walked, the stranger the woods became. The trees looked wrong, their bark twisted and split, oozing a dark sap-like substance. The ground grew softer, almost spongy, and the air felt colder with each step. Sam tightened his grip on his flashlight and quickened his pace, keeping the lantern in sight. "Wait!" he shouted, but the light always stayed just out of reach. The noises began. At first it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush, the snap of a distant branch, but soon Sam heard something else. Whispers. soft, fragmented voices that seemed to rise and fall with the lantern's sway. Sam stopped and turned in a slow circle, his flashlight scanning the trees. The whispers were everywhere, yet nowhere, an unsettling symphony of incomprehensible words. He shouted again, but his voice came out hoarse, his confidence eroding. Suddenly, the lantern stopped. It hovered in the mist, flickering erratically. Sam approached cautiously, raising his camera to snap a photo. The flash cut through the fog, and for a brief moment he saw it. The lantern wasn't floating. A figure held it, a shadowy, skeletal form draped in tattered cloth, its face obscured by a veil of darkness. Its bony hand gripped the lantern's handle, the light revealing fingers too long and sharp. When Sam lowered the camera, the figure was gone, but the whispers grew louder, angry now, hissing through the trees like wind through cracks in a door. Sam ran. His carefully marked path was gone, ribbons missing or torn. The fog thickened, swirling around him like smoke. Every direction looked the same, the oppressive darkness broken only by his flashlight's beam. Then he saw it, the lantern, closer now, moving faster. It weaved erratically, darting between the trees as if hunting him. Sam tripped, sprawling into the damp earth, his flashlight rolling from his grip. In the dark, he heard it, a wet, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the ground. Scrambling to his feet, Sam grabbed his flashlight and spun around. The lantern was inches away, its golden glow illuminating the skeletal figure that held it. Its head tilted slowly as though observing him, and the whispers ceased, replaced by a guttural croak that chilled him to his core. The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing against Sam's arm. The cold was unbearable, like plunging into icy water. He screamed, tearing himself free and running blindly through the woods. The lantern followed. Sam didn't know how long he ran, his lungs burning, his legs numb. The whispers returned, louder now, forming words he could almost understand. "Stay with us," they seemed to say. Finally, he burst into a clearing. The fog lifted slightly, revealing an old, weathered sign. Devil's Hollow Cemetery. Graves lay scattered across the ground, their stones cracked and covered in moss. In the center stood a tall, crooked tree, and beneath it an unlit lantern hung from a rusted hook. Sam stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath. The whispers surrounded him, coming from the graves, the trees, the air itself. The lantern he'd followed was gone, but the cold remained, seeping into his bones. He turned to run, but the ground beneath him shifted. Hands, pale, skeletal hands, burst from the earth, clawing at his boots. He screamed, kicking and thrashing as they pulled him downward. The last thing Sam saw was the crooked tree, its branches like skeletal arms reaching for the sky. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices that followed him into the dark. When search parties found Sam's abandoned camera weeks later, the images were chilling. Blurry shots of the lantern, the skeletal figure, and finally an outstretched hand reaching for the lens. Sam's body was never recovered, but hikers who dare venture near Devil's Hollow Cemetery often report seeing a lantern in the fog, swaying gently, always just out of reach. Nestled deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest lies an abandoned firewatch cabin perched precariously on the edge of a cliff. It has no official name, no records in park maps, and most rangers deny its existence. Locals call it the cabin that waits, warning of the strange fates that befall those who find it. But for Zach and Alyssa, a couple of avid hikers with a thirst for the unknown, the mystery was too tempting to ignore. They set out on a crisp autumn morning, the air tinged with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Zach had stumbled upon a mention of the cabin in an old cryptic hiking forum. The directions were vague, but they'd pieced together enough clues to plot their route. They packed lightly, but prepared for an overnight stay, just in case. The first day's hike was uneventful. The forest was serene, the golden sunlight filtering through the canopy. They laughed, took photos, and marveled at the untouched beauty of the wilderness. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. The trees grew taller, their branches knitting together to blot out the sky. The forest floor became uneven, dotted with patches of slick moss and jagged roots that seemed to reach for their ankles. By the time they spotted the cabin, the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. It stood at the end of a narrow, rocky path, its silhouette outlined against the blood-orange sky. The structure was weathered but intact, its wooden walls darkened by time. A single, clouded window stared out at them like a blind eye. "This is it!" Zach exclaimed. pulling Alyssa forward despite her hesitation. As they approached, the air seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration that set their teeth on edge. The cabin's door creaked open with a light push, revealing a small room with sparse furniture. A rickety table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace filled with cold, gray ash. The walls were covered in deep scratches as though something with claws had tried to escape. "I don't like this," Alyssa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just old," Zach replied, brushing off her unease. He pulled out his phone to document their discovery, but the screen glitched, displaying static before shutting off entirely. Alyssa's phone did the same. "I guess no selfies," Zach joked, though his voice lacked confidence. As night fell, the forest around the cabin grew impossibly dark. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe. They lit a fire in the hearth, its glow barely reaching the corners of the room. Alyssa swore she heard faint scratching outside, but Zach convinced her it was just animals. Then came the knocks. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. Zach froze, his hand gripping the flashlight. Alyssa whispered, "Who could that be?" "We're in the middle of nowhere." "Probably just the wind," Zach said, though his eyes betrayed him. 3 more knocks, louder this time. Zach crept to the door, flashlight in hand. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. He flung the door open to reveal nothing, just the dense, impenetrable darkness of the forest. He slammed the door shut, locking it with a rusted latch. "No one's there," he said, his voice tight. But Alyssa wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the window. "Zach," she whispered, her voice quaking. There, just outside the glass, was a face, pale, featureless, and pressed against the pane as though trying to peer inside. Zach grabbed a chair and hurled it at the window, shattering the glass. The face disappeared, but the air in the cabin grew colder, the fire sputtering weakly as if suffocated by an unseen force. "We're leaving," Alyssa said, her voice firm. They grabbed their packs and bolted out of the cabin, their flashlight beams cutting through the oppressive darkness. The trail back was gone, swallowed by the forest. No matter which way they turned, they found themselves circling back to the cabin, its broken window glaring at them like a wound. The whispers started then. Faint at first, like wind through the trees, but soon they grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of desperate voices. "Stay. Don't leave. It's not safe out there." Alyssa covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. Zach shouted into the void, demanding the voices stop, but the whispers only grew louder, more frantic. They retreated to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind them. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the crackling of the dying fire. The cold seeped into their bones and exhaustion overtook them. They decided to wait until dawn, praying that daylight would show them the way out. But dawn never came. The window, now somehow intact, revealed only endless night. The fire refused to light again, and the air grew colder with each passing hour. Zach found claw marks etched into the floorboards that hadn't been there before. Alyssa swore she saw shadows moving in the corners of the room, though there was no light to cast them. Eventually, they stopped speaking, each retreating into a silent, terrified vigil. The whispers returned, softer now, murmuring directly into their ears. "You're part of it now. It's waiting for you." When search teams found the cabin weeks later, it was empty. The fireplace was cold, the table overturned, and 2 backpacks lay untouched by the door. The only sign of Zach and Alyssa was a series of fresh claw marks on the walls and floor, each one deeper and more frenzied than the last. To this day, hikers claim to see a faint light in the forest near Devil's Bluff, always flickering near an impossible trailhead. Those brave enough to follow swear the cabin looks different each time, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, but always waiting, its door slightly ajar as if inviting them in. Far out in the Appalachian wilderness lies a trail few dare to tread. Known as Whispering Ridge, it is said to be a place where the forest listens and answers. The locals speak in hushed tones about the ridge, warning that those who venture there don't always return, and those who do often come back broken, haunted by something they refuse to describe. Amara, an experienced solo hiker and a self-proclaimed skeptic, had heard the stories. She dismissed them as folklore meant to scare tourists. She prided herself on her ability to navigate the most remote and treacherous trails, so when she stumbled upon a weathered map at a small town store with Whispering Ridge marked in faded ink, she felt an irresistible pull to explore it. Her journey began like any other. The first day was picturesque. with the trail winding through dense forests and offering stunning views of mist-laden valleys. Amara marveled at the quiet beauty of the landscape, the way the sunlight danced through the leaves. But as the sun began to set, the forest seemed to change. The air grew still, as though the woods were holding their breath. The usual sounds of nature, birds, insects, rustling leaves, faded into an eerie silence. Amara shrugged it off, convincing herself it was simply her mind playing tricks. She pitched her tent on a flat patch of ground near the ridge's edge, made herself a quick meal, and crawled into her sleeping bag, ready for a peaceful night. But sleep didn't come. At first she heard faint murmurs, so quiet she thought it might be the wind. She opened her tent flap, shining her flashlight into the darkness. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. She saw nothing unusual, so she zipped up the tent and lay back down, clutching her flashlight. Then the whispers began. They were distinct now, words spoken just beyond comprehension, as though dozens of voices were murmuring in unison. Amara froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She strained to listen, trying to make sense of the sounds. "Come closer," one voice finally said, clear and sharp. Amara sat up, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, heavy and oppressive. Then, something scratched against the side of her tent. She screamed, unzipping the tent in a frenzy and stumbling out into the darkness. The beam of her flashlight cut through the trees, but there was no one there. The air was icy now, her breath fogging as she tried to steady her racing heart. She decided to pack up and leave, her instincts screaming at her to get off the ridge. But as she gathered her things, she realized something horrifying. The trail markers she'd followed were gone. The path she'd taken to the ridge was now an unbroken line of trees, the forest seeming to close in around her. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, but the words felt hollow. As she tried to find her way back, the whispers returned. They came from every direction, growing louder, overlapping into a maddening cacophony. Her flashlight flickered, the bulb struggling against an unseen force. Then she saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely distinguishable from the trees. They were tall and impossibly thin, their limbs stretched in unnatural ways. Their faces were blank, smooth as polished wood, but she could feel their gaze boring into her. Amara stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the cold ground. The figures didn't move, but seemed to sway, as though pushed by a breeze she couldn't feel. The whispers grew deafening now. The words finally clear. "You shouldn't have come." In a blind panic, she ran. Her flashlight died completely, leaving her to navigate in darkness. The forest seemed alive, the branches clawing at her like skeletal fingers. She tripped and fell repeatedly, her hands and knees raw and bleeding. The whispers followed her, relentless, taunting. Finally, she saw it, a faint light in the distance. She ran toward it, her chest burning, tears streaming down her face. She burst into a clearing and stopped dead. It wasn't the trailhead. It was an old, decrepit house, its windows glowing faintly with an unnatural, sickly green light. The front door creaked open as if beckoning her inside. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, the figures closing in. With no other choice, Amara stepped inside. The interior was worse than she could have imagined. The walls were covered in strange, shifting symbols that seemed to writhe under her gaze. The floor was slick with something she didn't want to identify, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. At the center of the room stood a mirror, its surface black and rippling like liquid. She felt an irresistible pull toward it, her feet moving of their own accord. The whispers filled the room now, echoing off the walls, chanting in unison, "See yourself, become us." Amara stared into the mirror, and her reflection stared back. But it wasn't her. The face was twisted, hollow-eyed, its mouth curling into a grotesque smile. The reflection reached out of the mirror, its cold, skeletal hand gripping her wrist. She screamed as the darkness swallowed her whole. When a search party eventually found her campsite, it was abandoned. Her tent was torn, her belongings scattered. The only clue was a single, weathered photograph of Amara, taken at the trailhead. In the photo, a faint figure could be seen standing behind her in the trees, its blank face turned toward the camera. To this day, hikers near Whispering Ridge report hearing faint whispers on the wind, and some claim to see a pale figure watching them from the trees. Locals say the ridge takes what it wants, and that if you hear it calling, it's already too late. Deep within the boreal forests of northern Canada lies a glacial lake known only to a handful of locals. Called Silent Mirror by those brave enough to mention it, the lake is notorious for its glass-like surface, which never ripples, even in the fiercest winds. Stories say the lake doesn't just reflect what's above, it reveals what's hidden below, and sometimes it shows things that shouldn't be seen. Jack, an experienced wilderness guide, had always dismissed the tales as fanciful exaggerations. Hired by a wealthy businessman to document untouched landscapes, Jack decided Silent Mirror would be the crown jewel of their trip. Despite warnings from the locals, Jack and his group, Mia, an environmental researcher, Tom, a photographer, and Greg, the client, embarked on the expedition. The trek was grueling, the forest dense and unrelenting. Days passed in relative normalcy, save for the growing tension among the group. The forest seemed to press in around them, the towering pines casting long, eerie shadows even at midday. When they finally reached the lake, it was more striking than any of them had imagined. The water was impossibly clear, reflecting the surrounding forest with an almost unnatural precision, but there was something unsettling about its stillness. Not a single ripple disturbed the surface, not even when Greg tossed a pebble into the water. The stone vanished without a sound, as if the lake had swallowed it whole. Creepy, but beautiful, Mia muttered, shivering despite the warmth of the day. Tom set up his camera, eager to capture the lake's uncanny beauty. Jack surveyed the area, marking potential campsites, while Greg wandered closer to the water's edge, staring into its depths. "Looks like it goes on forever," Greg said, his voice distant. Jack joined him and peered into the lake. It did seem bottomless, an endless void of dark blue. But as Jack leaned closer, something shifted. Shadows moved beneath the surface, shapes too large to be fish. He blinked, and they were gone. That night, as they sat around the campfire, the forest was unnervingly silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. Greg, emboldened by a flask of whiskey, joked about swimming in the lake. "Bet it's freezing," Mia said. "Bet it's cursed," Tom replied, only half joking. Greg laughed, but his laughter faltered as a soft splash echoed from the direction of the lake. "What was that?" Mia asked, her voice tight. "Probably a fish," Jack said, though he didn't believe it. They decided to turn in for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. Jack lay awake, staring at the canvas of his tent. The silence pressed against his ears like a physical weight. Then he heard it, a low, mournful sound, like someone humming a tune just out of earshot. He bolted upright, grabbing his flashlight. The humming stopped, replaced by the faint sound of footsteps outside his tent. "Who's there?" Jack called, his voice firm. No answer. He stepped outside, sweeping his flashlight across the campsite. Everyone's tents were closed, and the fire had burned down to embers. But as he turned toward the lake, his breath caught. A figure stood at the water's edge, its back to him. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its silhouette blurred as though seen through heat waves. The figure leaned forward, staring into the lake. "Greg?" Jack whispered, though he knew it wasn't him. The figure's head snapped to the side, as if hearing Jack's voice. Slowly, it turned. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging Jack into darkness. When morning came, Greg was gone. They searched the area, calling his name, but found no trace of him. His tent was untouched, his boots still inside. The only clue was a trail of wet footprints leading from his tent to the lake. Tom wanted to leave immediately, but Mia insisted they stay and report Greg's disappearance properly. Reluctantly, Jack agreed, though every instinct told him to run. That night, the humming returned, louder this time. Jack, Mia, and Tom huddled in the center of the campsite, their flashlights scanning the darkness. Shadows moved at the edge of the firelight, flickering like candle flames. Then the whispers began. They came from all directions, soft and insistent. Jack couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. He covered his ears, but the whispers grew louder, drilling into his skull. Tom screamed. Jack spun around and saw him stumbling toward the lake, his eyes wide and unfocused, his flashlight dangling limply from his hand. "Stop! Stop!" Jack shouted, chasing after him. But Tom didn't stop. He walked into the water, his movements slow and deliberate, as though guided by an unseen force. The lake swallowed him without a splash, and the surface returned to perfect stillness. Mia sobbed, clutching Jack's arm. "We have to leave." Jack didn't argue. They grabbed what they could carry and ran, abandoning the rest of their gear. The forest seemed alive now, the trees twisting and shifting, the path ahead disappearing and reappearing in impossible ways. At one point, they looked back and saw the lake, impossibly close despite the miles they'd traveled. Figures stood along its shore, their faces blank and pale, their arms outstretched. By dawn, they stumbled out of the forest, battered and shaken. Mia refused to speak of what happened, and Jack couldn't find the words to explain it. Greg and Tom were never found. Search teams reported no lake in the area, only dense forest where silent mirrors should have been. But Jack knew what he saw, and sometimes, late at night, he swore he could still hear the whispers. To this day, he avoids mirrors and bodies of water, terrified of what might be staring back at him. There's a hiking trail in the Rockies known only by word of mouth, a narrow, unmarked route called the Vanishing Path. It doesn't appear on any map, and the park rangers refuse to acknowledge its existence. The trail is said to offer breathtaking views and an eerie stillness that even seasoned hikers find unsettling. But it comes with a warning. Never follow the cairns at dusk. Marcus and his friends, Rachel and Eric, were avid hikers who thrived on exploring the unknown. They'd heard whispers about the Vanishing Path and decided to track it down during their week-long camping trip. The thrill of uncovering something off-limits was too tempting to resist. The first few days of their trip were typical, challenging hikes, scenic views, and nights spent sharing stories around the campfire. On the fourth day, while traversing a ridge, they found it, a faint trail winding up a steep incline, marked by a line of weathered stone cairns. "This has to be it," Rachel said, her eyes lighting up with excitement. Eric was hesitant. "You really want to follow an unmarked trail? What if we get lost?" "Relax," Marcus said. "We've got GPS, and it's broad daylight. Let's check it out." They ascended the trail, the forest growing denser with each step. The air felt heavier, cooler, as though the sun's warmth was being drained. Despite the unnerving atmosphere, the group pressed on, marveling at the untouched beauty of the wilderness. By the time they reached a clearing near the summit, the sun was beginning to set. The view was spectacular, a sea of trees stretching endlessly below, the horizon painted in fiery hues of orange and red. As Rachel snapped photos, she noticed something odd. "The cairns are different up here," she said, pointing. The stone stacks now stood taller and more intricate, some balanced in impossible configurations. They seemed to form a new path, leading deeper into the woods. "We should head back," Eric said, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. "Come on," Rachel urged. "Just a little further. It's not every day you find something like this." Against his better judgment, Eric followed. Marcus, always the leader, took the lead, guiding them along the eerie trail. As dusk fell, the cairns became more elaborate, some adorned with strange carvings. The forest grew silent, the usual sounds of nature replaced by an oppressive stillness. Then, they noticed something alarming. Their GPS devices had stopped working. "Okay, we're turning back," Eric said, his voice shaking. But when they turned around, the path was gone. The cairns that had marked their way had vanished, leaving no trace of the trail they'd followed. Panic set in as they fumbled through the forest, trying to find their way. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The light of the setting sun faded entirely, plunging them into darkness. "Stay close," Marcus said, his voice taut with fear. Then they heard it, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps in the underbrush. "Who's there?" Rachel called, her voice trembling. No answer, only the sound of movement growing closer. Marcus shone his flashlight in the direction of the noise, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. Then, out of the shadows, they saw it. A figure standing motionless between the trees. It was humanoid but wrong, its proportions distorted. Its face was featureless, as though sculpted from wax and left unfinished. "Run!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Rachel's arm. They bolted through the forest, the creature's heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing behind them. The air grew colder with each step, their breaths forming clouds in the frigid night. Eric tripped and fell, screaming as the creature loomed over him. Marcus and Rachel turned back, but before they could reach him, the figure bent down, its elongated arms wrapping around Eric's body. He let out a strangled cry as the creature pulled him into the darkness. Marcus and Rachel ran blindly, their lungs burning, their legs trembling. Just when they thought they couldn't go any further, they stumbled into another clearing. The cairns were there, forming a circle around a single, ancient-looking tree. In the center of the circle stood Eric. "Eric!" Rachel shouted, rushing toward him. "Wait!" Marcus grabbed her arm, stopping her in her tracks. Something was wrong. Eric stood unnaturally still, his back to them. As they approached cautiously, he turned and their hearts sank. His face was blank, featureless, just like the creature's. Eric raised an arm and pointed at the cairns. Slowly, they began to collapse, the stones falling one by one. With each collapse, the forest seemed to twist and warp, the ground shifting beneath their feet. Rachel screamed as Marcus pulled her away, dragging her back into the woods. They ran until they could no longer hear the sound of falling stones. By some miracle, they stumbled onto a familiar trail just as dawn broke. Exhausted and terrified, they made their way back to their campsite and packed up immediately, leaving most of their gear behind. When they reported Eric's disappearance to the rangers, their story was met with skepticism. The ranger they spoke to simply shook his head and said, "You shouldn't have followed the cairns." To this day, Marcus refuses to hike, and Rachel hasn't spoken about what they saw. The vanishing path remains a mystery, its secrets guarded by the forest and the silent figures that lurk within. Those who venture too far don't always return, and those who do carry with them the haunting memory of what waits beyond the cairns. Hidden deep in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest is a narrow trail that locals call Hollow Creek Pass. It's rarely traveled, not just because of its remoteness, but because of the sinister legend attached to it. A cabin that appears only to the lost, offering shelter at a deadly cost. Megan, Caleb, and Jess, lifelong friends with a love of backcountry hiking, had heard the tale from an old guide. They laughed it off as campfire nonsense but when Megan suggested they take Hollow Creek Pass for their weekend trek, Caleb hesitated. "Why risk it? There's plenty of other trails," Caleb said. "Come on," Jess replied with a grin. "Scary stories make it more fun." Reluctantly, Caleb agreed, and they set out early Saturday morning. The trail was stunning. Moss-covered trees towered above, and the crisp air carried the scent of pine and damp earth. The creek that gave the trail its name trickled alongside them, its clear water shimmering in the sunlight. But as the day wore on, the trail became harder to follow. The markers faded, and the once clear path twisted into confusing forks. By the time the sun began to dip behind the mountains, they realized they were hopelessly lost. "Let's set up camp and figure it out in the morning," Megan said, trying to keep her voice steady. Caleb agreed, though the unease gnawing at his gut told him they should keep moving. As they pitched their tents, Jess froze. "Guys, do you hear that?" The group went silent. Faintly, over the sound of the creek, came a soft, rhythmic knocking. "Maybe it's an animal?" Megan suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "It's probably just a tree branch," Caleb said, more to reassure himself than anyone else. But as darkness fell, the knocking grew louder, more deliberate, and closer. "I don't like this," Jess whispered. Then they saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. "Is that a cabin?" Megan asked, incredulous. "It can't be," Caleb said. "We're miles from any marked settlement." Jess, desperate for reassurance, grabbed her flashlight. "If someone's there, they can help us." Before Caleb could stop her, she was heading toward the light. Megan followed, and Caleb, muttering a curse, brought up the rear. The cabin looked old but surprisingly intact, its wooden walls weathered but sturdy. A single window glowed with warm, inviting light, and smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. Jess knocked on the door. It swung open on its own, revealing a cozy interior. A crackling fire, plush armchairs, and a table set with steaming bowls of stew. "This doesn't feel right," Caleb said, his voice low. "Would you rather stay out there with the knocking?" Jess snapped, stepping inside. The warmth was intoxicating after the chill of the forest, and despite his better judgment, Caleb followed. The door closed behind them with a soft click. At first, the cabin felt like a godsend. The stew was delicious, and the chairs seemed to cradle them perfectly, as though tailored to their bodies. But as the hours passed, the comforting atmosphere began to feel oppressive. The air grew heavy, the shadows longer. "We should go," Caleb said, standing abruptly. "Go where?" Jess asked. "It's pitch black out there. This place is safe." Megan nodded, though her hands fidgeted in her lap. Caleb went to the door and turned the handle. It wouldn't budge. "What's wrong?" Megan asked, her voice tense. "It's stuck," Caleb said, yanking harder. Suddenly, the fire dimmed, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and writhe. "Did you see that?" Jess whispered, staring at the corner of the room. The others turned to look. At first, it seemed like just another shadow, But then it moved, taller than a person, its shape indistinct. "Who's there?" Caleb demanded, his voice shaking. The shadow didn't respond, but it grew darker, denser, until it seemed to suck the light from the room. The cabin creaked, its walls groaning as though under immense pressure. The stew bowls shattered on the table, their contents spilling onto the floor, which now looked warped and slick, like oil. "We have to get out!" Megan screamed. They tried the windows, but the glass wouldn't break. The shadow advanced, its form shifting and pulsating, tendrils of darkness reaching toward them. "It's the cabin," Caleb shouted. "It's not letting us go." Jess, in a panic, grabbed a burning log from the fireplace and hurled it at the shadow. It passed through harmlessly, landing on the floor and setting the rug ablaze. The fire spread rapidly, the cabin filling with thick, acrid smoke. The shadow shrieked, a sound so piercing it made their ears bleed. With the walls cracking and the floor collapsing, the door finally burst open. They ran into the night, the forest alight with the glow of the burning cabin. When they turned back, the cabin was gone. There was no fire, no smoke, just an empty clearing where it had stood moments before. The group stumbled through the woods until dawn, eventually finding their way back to the main trail. They reported what happened to the authorities, but no trace of the cabin was ever found. To this day, Caleb swears he sometimes hears knocking when he's alone in his house late at night. Megan refuses to hike altogether, and Jess hasn't spoken to either of them since. The trail remains a silent reminder of the cabin that shouldn't exist, a place that offers shelter to the lost, only to keep them forever.